Psalm 101. It seems from my study that the next three Psalms go well together in the sense that perhaps maybe they were written together or they were written for the intent of being sung at the same time. I don't know when these were written exactly, and I don't know what the circumstances around them obviously were. But the Psalm 101 and Psalm 103 specifically purport to be a Psalm of David, and I contend based on Psalm 102 that it too would be a Psalm of David. And just an interesting note here, there are some commentators and some scholars, I'll put that in quotation marks, that like to separate the Psalms of David to like the first 72 or 3 or so. And I think Psalms like this prove that David may have written a lot more of the Psalms than he gets credit for. Now, obviously, God is the author. The Holy Spirit guided these men either to write these or guided David to include them in the Psalms as inspired. And so, however that happened, God determined that these words were his words, right? But I think it goes to kind of show that sometimes the scholars don't always get it right, do they? And I think perhaps Psalms like these that we're about to look at may throw a cog into their thinking about how they divide these up, and why they want to divide them up, I'm not sure. I don't know why they want to. But anyway, Psalm 101 is an interesting psalm that, like I said, I think goes well with the next three. And the previous 3 or 4, we talked about how they kind of went well together and may have been sang at the same time or written at the same time or both. But the intriguing nature of Psalm 101 is the introduction of the psalm. I will sing of mercy and judgment unto thee, O Lord, will I sing. But as we look at the context, as we look at it this afternoon, we're going to note that David here is not necessarily singing a song of praise about God's mercy and God's judgment, as much as he's singing a song of praise to God about how he intends to apply wisdom and judgment in his house. So it's a psalm that's kind of different in that sense. It's not a psalm necessarily thanking God for his mercy and judgment, though there are many psalms that do that. And David and other inspired writers gave God a lot of credit for his mercy and justice. But here we have the psalmist singing a song about how he intends to apply wisdom and justice, obviously defined by God and commanded by God, to his house. Now, we don't know exactly the time of the writing of this psalm or the circumstance around this psalm, but it does seem to me that it would have been during the time when David was king, because David speaks about his house in a sense where you might think of someone having a lot of people into his house. David would have had a lot of people, servants, employees, things of that nature, besides family members. The other thing too here is, I'm not sure, like I said, when it was written or about what time it was, or what circumstance it was written. But there were many times in David's life where he wasn't very merciful or just in his own house, was he? He didn't. Notice verse 2, he says, I will behave myself wisely in a perfect way. There were times when David acted very foolish as it applied to his house, right? He obviously paid heavily for some sins that he committed in his home, right? And we might think of the sin with Bathsheba in particular, and bringing in Bathsheba's husband at that time and lying to him and deceiving him, and all those took place in David's house, you see. So would this psalm be after that, perhaps? Maybe David writing a psalm about learning some hard lessons the hard way, and how he plans from that point on to live and apply that wisdom and judgment into his house. I lean that way, because obviously had he sung this song or written this before some of these other events, then he obviously had a hard time keeping his word. I would contend, I think, that this would have taken place after that, after he had learned some things the hard way. And it goes to show that sometimes in our past we may have not acted like we would wish we would have, right? But that doesn't keep us from starting now. We can say now we're going to act wisely in a perfect way, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just because we've made mistakes in the past, we can start now if we need to. So he says, I will behave myself wisely in a perfect way. Oh, when wilt thou come unto me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart. It's almost as if he's inviting God to come and see. I want you to see how I live. I want you to see that I'm applying your principles in my way of living, in my home. And he's asking God to come and watch and see that he's doing that. And of course he says, I will walk wisely, and we've just pointed out one instance, but there were many instances when David didn't act very wisely, and in fact he acted foolishly. But his son Solomon wrote a great deal about wisdom, didn't he? And perhaps in the Proverbs, Solomon was writing some things he learned from David. And of course, obviously, he was writing of things that he had heard from God. In Proverbs 4, verse 7, Solomon, the Proverbs writer, says, wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. Exalt her, and she shall promote thee. She shall bring thee to honor when thou dost embrace her. Chapter 5, verse 1, Solomon writes to his sons, my son, attend unto my wisdom, and bow thine ear to my understanding. Skip over to chapter 9, verse 9. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In fact, the Proverbs writer says several things are the beginning. All begin with the fear of the Lord. If you don't respect God, you're not going to be wise. And that goes to what David's writing about here, isn't it? When he says, I'm going to behave myself wisely in a perfect way, he's showing that I respect God and I respect God's way. That's the perfect way. And I'm going to apply that to my living and in my house. So obviously David's son continues this idea of behaving wisely, and Solomon himself didn't act wisely all the time, did he? But nonetheless, wisdom comes from God. And we can only be wise if we trust God, fear God, believe God, and want to apply that to our lives. So David then says in verse 3, I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that turn aside from the perfect way, verse 2. It shall not cleave to me. So, well, let's just continue, because I think these next few verses kind of go along with it. A froward heart, or a perverse heart, shall depart from me. I will not know a wicked person in my house, is the idea, right? I'm not going to allow this stuff in my home. Whoso privately slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. He's not coming into my house. Him that hath a high look and a proud heart. You know, Solomon talked about in the Proverbs Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So he says, he who has a high look and a proud heart will not I suffer. So here in verse 3, 4, and 5, David says, after he's already said, I'm going to be wise in how I deal with my home. And this is obviously very practical for us, isn't it? This is how we ought to be living in our home. Obviously, I think in the context, David's home is very large, and he's got servants and other things that we may not have, but still the principle applies to our home. What are we going to let happen in our home? How are we going to live in our home? Who are we going to allow to make statements in our home? And he says, I'm not going to let wicked people come into my home. I'm not going to allow wicked to come into my home and everybody go, there's wickedness in David's home. Now, that's not to say that everybody that goes into David's house is perfect or even a follower of God, right? We might have people into our home who are not Christians. We might have people into our home who have done horrible things, right? But the idea is when they're in our home, we're going to make sure that we have people in our home who are respectful and dignified, and we're going to try to teach them through the way we live. But if they bring in wickedness, they don't have a place in our home, right? That might be the last time they're welcome in our home. Because if you bring wickedness into your home and you allow it to stay there and it's welcomed in your home, what are you going to end up being, right? A froward heart or a perverse heart shall depart from me. In other words, if you bring in your wickedness and your deceit and your perverseness, you're not welcome here. David said there's some things that are not welcome in my house. He who privately slanders his neighbor, I'm cutting off. You're not coming in. So, verse 7, drop down to verse 7. He that worketh deceit shall not dwell within my house. This is the reason I think he might be referring to after the time he was a king, because he had people dwelling in his house that weren't relatives. He may have had servants, and he says, if you're deceitful, if he that telleth lies shall not tarry in my sight. When you put all this together, you see this picture of, if you come into my home, you need to respect God as my home respects God. Don't come in here with your lies. Don't come in here with your gossip. Don't come in here with your froward heart, your perverseness. Don't come in here and try to bring stuff into my home that would make me separated from God. I'm not going to have it. And so this is obviously practical for us today. Who are we going to have in our home? What do we have in our home? What do we eschew from our home? We don't want any of this deceit. We don't want frivolity. We don't want these slanderers. We don't want these perverse things. We don't want these wicked things. If we keep them out of our home, then we're going to keep them out of our heart. So then, verse 6, he says, mine eyes shall be upon the faithful of the land. These are the people who are welcome in my house, David says. That they may dwell with me. He that walketh in a perfect way, he shall serve me. Another indication of who he might be talking about. Now, obviously, David was the king over people who were supposed to be God's people anyway. And so they should have been doing things in a perfect way or God's way. But obviously not all of them were. That's why there was so much turmoil in Israel. Because, if you looked at it from a distance, you'd just say they're just like any other nation. And sadly, when they asked for a king, that's what they asked for, wasn't it? That we be like all the other nations. So here's a nation that's supposed to be God's people, but they went in wrong directions. But here David, at this point in his life, perhaps having gone through some bad times and making foolish decisions, he realizes, I've got to keep some of this stuff out of my home. I've got to make my home a place of refuge and solace. It's got to be for God. Now, I wish our elected officials would read Psalm 101. Because if the king says, this is what our kings and our leaders should be reading and saying, right? I'm going to have mercy. I'm going to be just. I'm going to deal wisely in God's way, in accordance with God's way. That's a perfect way. And that's if our kings and our leaders around the world would apply this to their houses, we'd have a lot better world to live in. So we can apply this practically to our homes, but I think in the context of David being a king, our leaders need to read this psalm a lot. Who are you letting in your house? Who have you got in your cabinet? Who have you got giving you advice, right? And a lot of people have learned the hard way what happens when you put foolish people in high positions around you who you trust. But David says, mine eyes shall be upon the faithful of the land. Now, once again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the only people who are going to be allowed into his home are people who are faithful to God. But they're going to be people who respect David's stance about what's in my home and what's not. But it is a strong statement to say, my eyes, I'm not going to look at wicked things, perverse things, foolish things, gossip, lies. I'm just going to look at the things of the faithful. They may dwell with me. He that walketh in a perfect way, he shall serve me. Now, this is what God's been talking about all along, isn't it? Since the very beginning of time. This is God's statement, right? I mean, you could look at David and say, here's the king making a statement about his home. But isn't this what God said about his? My eyes are upon the faithful. I'm not going to have any association with sin or wickedness. I mean, this is basically what God says. The faithful will dwell with me, right? So then verse 8, he says, I will early destroy all the wicked of the land, that I may cut off all wicked doers from the city of the Lord. And the city of the Lord there, I think, to be a reference to Jerusalem, which obviously under the Old Covenant was the place of worship. It was where God had set his name to be worshipped, where all the Jews had to assemble once a year to worship. And David here makes a stand that not only in my house, but in the capital city of the kingdom that God put me in charge of, the place where God determined that we would worship him, I'm going to do my best to keep it pure and holy. And I think that's what he means when he says, I will early destroy all the wicked of the land. I think the idea is I will work every day. I will get up early every day trying to rid this city of wickedness. Now, from all the other Psalms we've studied, the idea of cutting off all the wicked is a high task, isn't it? I mean, there were a lot of people who were chasing David, hating David, trying to kill David, causing David problems. We look at perhaps a similar example in the New Testament. Paul was running for his life, right? But what was Paul doing? He was doing everything he could, early in the morning till late at night. That's dedication. When you talk about doing something early, you're talking about somebody who really wants to work, somebody who's dedicated, somebody who cares, somebody who stays in bed all day and then gets up around noon or 1:30 and then says, well, I think I'll do something for God today. That's not dedication. David said, I'm going to get up early and I'm going to work from daylight to dark trying to make this place pure. And that's what Paul did in the New Testament, wasn't he? But obviously the wicked are all around him. He was chased, but he was preaching the gospel of truth, the gospel of peace. And it was through that gospel that people could be freed from their sin and that they could overcome wickedness. And I think that's kind of the idea that David's presenting here is, I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to be dedicated to making this city, not just my home, but this city, a place that respects God. So an interesting psalm, different than a lot of the other psalms that we've looked at, in that he's singing about something that he intends to do. And of course, what he intends to do is follow God's example on mercy and justice and apply that to his life. And so from a practical standpoint, we can apply that to our homes. We can apply the principle of being dedicated to teaching pureness and holiness and ridding wickedness from our sight. And also, as we apply that to people who are in leadership roles and positions, to encourage them to read what kind of people they should have around them, helping them to make good, wise decisions. The wisest decision that anyone today can make is, because God said to hear his word and believe it, is to simply act upon those things that can help a person become a Christian. And that is to confess that Jesus is the Christ, ask God to forgive him and repent of those past sins that have separated him so long, and then be baptized in water to have those sins washed away, and through obedience have God add him to the church, Acts 2 verse 47. And then from that point on, continue to live wisely and in a perfect way, according to God's law, so that when Jesus returns, we'll be prepared. And God will see us as those who have walked in his way. That's what a wise person would do today, is to obey God's plan to save. And if you've already done that but have walked foolishly, separated yourself from God, God calls you back home, and you can make another wise decision, and that is to repent and ask God to forgive you. 1 John 1, 6 through 10 tells us he is faithful and just to do that if you'll turn away from your sin. Whatever your need is, we're here to help you in any way as we stand and sing.